Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, I'm here kind of in a dual capacity. So I am a team member on the Allen Institute's education team. I mostly work on undergraduate education as a curriculum writer. And I also have previously worked with UW Biology with Ellie Theobald, and like Caitlin said, we'll be starting that again in the fall. And today I'm really going to be talking about positioning biology in a social context, using textbooks as an example, and then talking at the end about some implications for open data. So just a quick outline. First, I'm going to talk about what it means to position biology in a social context, then go into some work we've done using intro bio textbooks and measuring the amount of science and society content they have within them, and then finally wrap up with some discussions about how open science could potentially be a tool to incorporate more science and society content. All right, you're going to see it again. It's vision and change. Vision and change as this driving framework for undergraduate biology education lists the ability to understand the relationship between science and society as one of 6 core competencies. If we look at the BioSkills Guide by Clemens et al., we can unpack this a little bit further to see what does that actually mean to understand the relationship between science and society. So this includes things like talking with students about ethics and ethical conduct within science, thinking about societal influences on science, so social, cultural, political influences, and lastly, thinking about how science impacts society, right, at both a local and a global scale. So if we look at this core competency and some background research, we can kind of get an idea of if this is prioritized. So previous work at the program level has shown that less than 20% of undergraduate biology programs include science and society as an explicit program level outcome. At the instructor level, also Clemens et al., instructors report that they are less likely to assess science and society as a core competency relative to the other core competencies listed in Vision and Change. So in the Theobald lab, we were really looking at this and wondering, all right, if instructors and programs are both reporting that this isn't as present as Vision and Change might suggest that it should be, then what might be driving that? Do instructors have access to curricular materials that are supporting them to include science and society content? So to tackle this question, we assembled the textbook team, we like to call ourselves. This is only 8 out of the 14 members. We somehow convinced a whole group of undergraduate students to read textbooks with us, which was great. And to explore this question of curricular resources and science and society content, we wanted to use introductory biology textbooks as a case study. Why did we choose textbooks? With the increased popularity of a flipped classroom model, especially during COVID, this often requires or involves some sort of pre-class reading assignment, right? Often from an assigned textbook. High structure courses also often have pre-work that involves textbooks or a reading of some sort. So we felt like textbooks were a good, case study to use to dive in and see, all right, how much science and society content are they including? For our research approach, we really had a 2-pronged approach. So first we wanted to assess prevalence. To what extent are these intro textbooks including this content? And then when that content did arise, we wanted to characterize those examples. So how are these textbooks trying to tackle science and society as a topic? And when they're talking about science and society, do they tend to favor one topic over another? Just a brief moment to check in on jargon. So this area of the literature goes by several names. So when I'm talking about science and society, it's really at this intersection, right, of if we think about Freire's concept of a critical consciousness, having students critically engage with issues of social justice in the world and not only telling them about those problems, but to Sam's point, right, about problem posing, right, how can they address those? And this lends really well to Ladson-Billings' socio-political consciousness as one tenet of culturally relevant pedagogy. The K-12 literature tends to use the phrase socio-scientific issues, which again is, when I'm saying science and society, really synonymous with that. And there's also this idea of humanizing biology education. And for the purposes of this work, we were using humanizing biology education as our main vocabulary. And our operational definition for that was humanizing content or humanizing biology education is the ability for students to view science in a social context and grapple with real-world problems of social justice within the field of biology. You'll probably hear me continue to use these synonymously. So if I say science and society or humanizing content, I'm talking about the same thing. For our methods, we used a convenience sample of 6 prominent introductory biology textbooks. These textbooks had also been used in previous research on textbooks, and you can find the list of actual textbooks in our supplemental materials. We, over the course of 8 weeks, iteratively designed our codebook with a team of 14 coders, and once we finalized that codebook, we used a rotating coding structure. When we were reading through these textbooks and coding passages, we wanted to look at a couple things. So instead of treating it as a binary, okay, awesome, I read this passage, I'd say that it's science and society. We wanted to be able to quantify to some extent how much of that passage was devoted to this content. So was it a single sentence that mentioned something science and society related? Was it multiple sentences? Was it multiple paragraphs, etc.? We also wanted to pay attention to the topic, right? Like, are we finding that more and more of these passages are talking about ethics or human genetics or climate change or whatnot? So I'm going to show you some examples from these textbooks. So textbook B, example 1, we've got here a single sentence. Efforts to control or reverse global warming present a challenge to people worldwide. All right, we're talking about global warming or climate change. I would say that's, some intersection of science and society. Example 2, a little bit longer, talking about the Paris Agreement. Goes into talking about the effectiveness of this agreement was recently called into question, however, when the US announced its intention to withdraw. So it's multiple sentences, it's longer than the first example, right? And it's also talking about this kind of debate over this policy change. Example 3, also about climate change. It states, in this respect, we in the industrialized world need to pay more attention to lessening the impact each of us makes, because even though the vast majority of the world's population is in developing countries, the overwhelming percentage of consumption of resources occurs in industrialized countries. Again, multiple sentences and longer. We wanted to develop a coding scheme that allowed us to account for this variation, right? Rather than it being a binary of science and society or not, how much are they devoting to talking about that subject, and how are they approaching that discussion? So in order to account for that, we created this continuum of humanization, as we were calling it. So if we think back to example 1, a single sentence, right? It's mentioning climate change and that's posing a problem to people, but not going into any more detail than that. So we put it on the left-hand side of this continuum, saying it's less humanizing, and we labeled that scarce. So it's scarcely talking about this. If we think about example 3 started to get into some discussions of inequities, right? Of resource consumption versus bearing the effects of climate change. We put that on the far right of the spectrum, or of the continuum, as it's, talking about this critical, social justice issue for students. And so using this continuum allowed us to account for this variation. For the purposes of time, I won't go too in depth on the definitions here, but we really, again, wanted to account for, are you just mentioning the topic but not going any further, versus are you talking about how maybe some people are disproportionately impacted by this than others, or that it's a critical social justice issue, or for nuance in the middle of the spectrum, that Paris Agreement quote, talking about how, is this something that reasonable people can disagree on? Are there pros and cons to this, nuanced take? So looking across these 6 textbooks, they amounted to about 9,600 pages of text and 343 chapters. The first question we usually get for this is oh, did you find one textbook that was so much science and society content? And we did not. It was rare, consistently rare across all of the textbooks. Looking at the quantity of these passages, I didn't say that. We flagged a total of 1,200 passages across all 6 of these textbooks. And these passages ranged from either, again, one sentence or a whole section of a chapter. And the vast majority of the passages we flagged, they were either one sentence or multiple sentences. So they tended to be on the shorter end of text. For looking at the continuum, the vast majority of our passages did fall on the left side of this continuum. So they were either categorized as scarce or they provided a little bit of detail, but it was fairly rare for passages to fall on that right-hand side talking about equity or talking about social justice. Again, we wanted to look at if different topics were more common than others in these passages. We found the most popular topic tended to be environmental topics. Also disease, nutrition and sustenance was fairly popular, human health generally, and treatment of disease. Disease and treatment of disease is a little tricky here. Disease is more of talking about on a public health scale. Treatment of disease was like drug development or administering healthcare. We also looked at the practice questions that were in each of these textbooks. So again, thinking back to the Clemens et al. Assessment of instructors, they said they tend to assess science and society less than the other core competencies. Well, I think these textbooks kind of reflect that as well in these practice problems. So of the 9,200 practice problems that were listed in these textbooks, only about 2.6% of them were flagged as being somewhere on our continuum of humanization. So in summary, the inclusion of this content was rare across these textbooks. When it was present, it tended to be on the left-hand side of the continuum, providing a little bit of detail, but not going much further. And some topics were more likely to be associated with humanizing passages than others. So for implications for future research, this is something that I'm personally very excited to explore more in graduate school, but really looking at, all right, is this lack of inclusion of humanizing content in textbooks indicative of a lack of this content in biology curriculum more broadly? And also diving deeper into what resources are available for instructors to incorporate this content into their courses, and how are students impacted when this content is present in class versus when it's absent? As an Allen Institute employee, I would be remiss without thinking, right, like, how would open data be a resource for this? So I actually started here as an intern with Caitlin, and she said, Maddie, like, your intern project, we've got this awesome set of Alzheimer's disease data, which Bijou mentioned. I think Bijou was a plant before my talk, because this is gonna lend really well into it. But I was bringing my science and society agenda, and I was like, okay, sweet, how could we use this open data resource to tackle this core competency? So again, Bijou already went over some of this, but we have data available here from a cohort of 84 postmortem brain donors, and it includes stuff like quantitative neuropathology, single-cell gene expression data, and a lot of donor demographic data. And when I was thinking about creating a curricular resource for instructors to use this data, I really wanted to have the start be, all right, before you even dive in to some neuropathology or gene expression, first looking at these 84 individuals who decided to donate their brain to science, and what does that process look like? So creating this lesson that Bijou touched on of the cultural and social considerations of brain donation and having students go through the donor metadata, looking at the demographics of the donors. This particular data set is predominantly white, so this lesson has them think through, all right, if that's our demographic composition, what research questions can we pursue with this? What are we limited in and we can't pursue? And so, yeah, a really great exploration and just kind of thinking about bioethics policies on a local and a global scale and comparing those two. So as final thoughts, it's a key component of undergraduate life sciences education that should be prioritized. Could open science be a tool for more instructors to include this? I think so. And further exploration into how students are impacted will be really valuable. I really want to thank, again, all these undergraduates that we convinced to read textbooks with us, and the whole Theobald Lab, as well as Caitlin and the Allen Institute for supporting that work.
All right, we have time for some questions. I also want to call out and thank Ingrid Redford, who was an undergraduate at the time of this project and is now a research associate here at the Allen Institute.
In your future work, are you going to focus mostly on UW biology classrooms, or are you going to compare like different types of institutions? Or I was just wondering what your plan was for that, if you had anything in mind.
Yeah, great question. No, the goal is definitely to expand beyond UW. So looking at institutions across the US, different types of institutions, yeah, definitely not limited to just the University of Washington.
down in front.
Great setup. I want to encourage you to consider open education resources, which some faculty and funded projects have begun to pursue for just this reason. Right? They're finding that the textbooks are inadequate. And then I think you could get into some really interesting questions about what's the interpretation of these social determinants and things like that. And anyway, it's a different direction, but I think there are some really nice resources out there.
Yeah,
that
I really appreciate
address redlining and things like that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, we got over there.
Oh, thank you. Fantastic study, and I just love how you went deeper than just the initial numbers, because you might have said, 1,200 indications in 9,000 pages. 1 in 10 pages, that's not bad, but you went deeper to see that a lot of those are really small. So to push you a little bit farther on that, science and society questions tend to raise the level of cognitive complexity. It's hard to do multiple choice for something that's social justice based, right? So my question is, if you assume an amount of really deep assessment questions, do science and society types of questions tend to be what you would expect based on those deeper questions, and they're just less prevalent in the lower level questions, or do you have any thoughts on the kinds of questions that are showing up?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for that. Like you said, in these textbooks, they tend to be multiple choice questions. And for what we analyzed, something else I didn't share, we looked also at if answers were provided for the questions and if the answers also included humanizing content. And we actually found for that 2.6% of questions we flagged, not all of those answers were humanizing. So it's really interesting too. Some of those questions, right, in like the setup would mention climate change is a problem, and then go on to ask something that's kind of unrelated to the social element, but just is more of like, how do we reduce CO2 in the atmosphere or something? And so that is something we want to explore further of like, what makes, like, how do you assess this? Which I think we can borrow a lot from the humanities from, right? Like at institutions, there's whole departments that, like I minored in political science, so in all my political science classes, right, we were grappling with all of these as well. So I'm really excited about the idea of bringing that into a biology education space. But yeah, I think we are hoping to do more work to answer your question of trends and questions that would enable this to be better assessed. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
That's a very inspiring presentation. It's really good to see someone presenting on humanizing scientific content. A question I have is, I'm not sure how many undergrads still read textbooks for their classes.
It's a great question.
And I'm wondering, like, because a lot of classes are very incentivized, especially in like public universities like UW, students often take classes for credit instead of like interest. From an instructor perspective, how do you think like teachers and professors could incorporate that science and society material into their daily teaching to make it more interactive and engaging for the students?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And to the textbook point too, yes, I completely agree. It's pretty hard to, when we looked into the literature, it was hard to quantify like what percentage of students were using textbooks. But I think the idea here too, and especially going back to the slide talking about Freire and Ladson-Billings and like a socio-political consciousness, is that it's not just an isolated lesson in a class where it's like, okay, we checked the science and society box. That was our science and society lesson. The idea would be to integrate it across the entire course to where they're continuously seeing and grappling with these issues. So that would be the hope for instructors. And I think Sam brings up a great point of a lot of open education resources. I just saw a talk a week ago about a cure that's all about social justice and redlining, and that might actually be the one that you're talking about. But yeah, I think there's a ton of space for instructors to go and be able to embed this rather than have it be like standalone lessons.